What if a few drops of ink could unravel an empire? Can a mother's private plea to her daughter alter the course of a revolution? Could a signature on a piece of parchment doom a fellow queen and change a nation's destiny forever? And history is not just made on battlefields. It is often written in quiet rooms with a quill pen in a royal hand. A simple letter, a plea, a command, or a protest can carry more weight than an army. These are the stories of letters that crossed seas, challenged popes, and redrew the maps of the world. Number 15, what happens when a queen's surrender is not a surrender at all? The queen was tried for treason in her own throne room. Her accusers, a committee of foreign businessmen, converted the grand chamber into a courtroom. For her crime of trying to enact a new constitution for her people, she was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor, later commuted to imprisonment in a single upstairs room of her own palace. She was denied any visitors except for one lady in waiting. Her supporters were arrested and several were sentenced to death. This was the fate of Queen Liliʻuokalani of Hawaii in 1895. But the letter that changed everything was written 2 years earlier, on January 17, 1893. On that day, the Hawaiian kingdom was not at war. Honolulu was a peaceful capital, yet 162 armed sailors and Marines from the American warship USS Boston marched through the streets. They were not there at the request of the Queen. They were there at the request of a small group of non-native residents, mostly American sugar and pineapple plantation owners. This group called themselves the Committee of Safety. The committee's goal was simple. They wanted to overthrow the Hawaiian monarchy and have Hawaii annexed by the United States. They opposed the Queen's plan for a new constitution because it would restore voting power to native Hawaiians and take it away from the wealthy European and American residents who dominated the sugar industry. The Queen's motto was, "Hawaii for the Hawaiians," and this directly threatened their business interests. With American troops now on her soil, creating an atmosphere of military threat, the committee made its move. They declared the monarchy abolished and established a provisional government with Sanford B. Dole, a son of American missionaries, as its president. Queen Liliʻuokalani faced an impossible choice. Her royal guard numbered a few hundred men. They were loyal, but they were no match for the United States military. Any resistance would lead to a battle they could not win. It would mean the deaths of her people. Her advisors were split. Some urged her to fight for the honor of the kingdom. Others begged her to avoid a bloodbath. She chose the path of peace. But she did not simply surrender. Instead, she sat down and wrote a letter. It was not addressed to the Committee of Safety. They were, in her eyes, illegal insurrectionists. Her letter was addressed directly to the United States government. The document was carefully, brilliantly worded. It was a masterpiece of strategic communication. She wrote, "I, Liliʻuokalani, by the grace of God and under the Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom Queen, do hereby solemnly protest against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom by certain persons claiming to have established a provisional government of and for this kingdom." She was not recognizing their legitimacy. She was defining them as rebels. Then came the most important part. She explained her decision to yield. "Now, to avoid any collision of armed forces, and perhaps the loss of life, I do this under protest and impelled by said force yield my authority until such time as the government of the United States shall, upon the facts being presented to it, undo the action of its representatives and reinstate me in the authority which I claim as the constitutional sovereign of the Hawaiian Islands." This was not a letter of abdication. It was an appeal. She was not giving her kingdom to Sanford Dole and the sugar barons. She was temporarily placing her authority in the hands of the United States, the very power whose troops were threatening her, in the faith that its sense of justice would eventually prevail. She was turning a military coup into a legal dispute. The letter effectively paused the conflict and moved the battle from the streets of Honolulu to the halls of Washington, D.C. The immediate effect was the prevention of violence. The royal guard stood down. The provisional government took control of the palace and government buildings without a shot being fired. But the long-term effect of her letter was far greater. It created a legal and moral crisis for the United States. President Grover Cleveland, who took office shortly after the overthrow, received the Queen's letter and the facts of the case. He was an anti-imperialist and was outraged by what had happened. He withdrew the treaty of annexation that his predecessor had put before the Senate. He ordered an investigation led by former Congressman James H. Blount. The Blount report confirmed everything the Queen had claimed. It found that U.S. diplomatic and military representatives had abused their authority and were responsible for the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy. President Cleveland called the actions of the Committee of Safety an act of war and began to work towards restoring Liliʻuokalani to her throne. The sugar planters in Hawaii and their powerful allies in the U.S. Senate, however, refused to cooperate. Dole's provisional government defied the President of the United States, knowing he likely lacked the political will to use military force against fellow Americans. They dug in, declared themselves the Republic of Hawaii, and waited for a more expansion-minded president. They got one a few years later in William McKinley, and Hawaii was officially annexed in 1898, but the Queen's letter never lost its power. It became the foundational document for the Hawaiian sovereignty movement. It preserved the legal argument that the overthrow was illegal and that the transfer of sovereignty never legitimately occurred. For generations, her words have been a source of strength and a rallying cry for Native Hawaiians seeking justice and self-determination. In 1993, on the 100th anniversary of the overthrow, the U.S. Congress passed and President Bill Clinton signed the Apology Resolution. The resolution formally apologized to Native Hawaiians on behalf of the people of the United States for the nation's role in the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. The language in the resolution directly echoes the facts and claims first laid out in Queen Liliʻuokalani's letter of protest. A letter, written to avoid bloodshed, ended up preserving the history, the legal claim, and the spirit of a nation. Number 14. Could a queen's vow to a saint save a kingdom from a holy war? Jadwiga of Poland was crowned king in 1384, not queen. She was just 10 years old. The Polish nobility insisted on the title Rex King to make it clear that she was the monarch in her own right, not merely a consort. She was betrothed to William of Habsburg, an Austrian prince she had known since childhood, but the Polish lords had other plans. They wanted her to marry a man she had never met, Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. He was a pagan. He was considered a barbarian by much of Christian Europe, and he was an enemy of Poland. The reason for this unwanted marriage was the Teutonic Knights. The Knights were a German military religious order. They had originally come to the region to convert pagans to Christianity. But by the 14th century, they had become a powerful, aggressive state of their own. They controlled a large territory along the Baltic coast, cutting Poland off from the sea and trade. They constantly raided both Poland and Lithuania under the pretext of a holy crusade against the pagan Lithuanians. They were a mortal threat to both nations. The Polish lords reasoned that a marriage between Jadwiga and Jogaila would unite their two countries. Together, they would be strong enough to stand against the Knights. Lithuania would convert to Christianity, removing the Knights' excuse for war. Jadwiga was a devout Catholic. The idea of marrying a pagan was abhorrent to her. She was also a young girl in love with the prince she was promised to. The chronicles say she even tried to take an axe to the castle gates to escape and join William, but she was also a queen who understood her duty. She spent long hours in prayer, seeking guidance. The fate of two nations rested on her decision. She wrote letters to religious authorities, to her advisors, and to her former fiancé, breaking the engagement. Her most significant communications, however, were not with men, but with the Teutonic Knights themselves. After she agreed to the marriage, Jogaila was baptized, taking the name Ladislaw, and they were married in 1386. The Union of Poland and Lithuania was formed, but the Teutonic Knights did not stop their aggression. The conversion of Lithuania had robbed them of their primary mission, but not their ambition. They now claimed the conversion was fake. They continued to raid Polish and Lithuanian lands and spread propaganda across Europe, painting Jogaila as a false Christian and the Union as a threat. This is where Jadwiga's letters changed the game. She was not just a symbol of the Union, she was its chief diplomat. While her husband was a warrior, Jadwiga was a peacemaker. She began a long and patient correspondence with the Grand Masters of the Teutonic Order. Her letters were not filled with threats or anger. They were calm, reasoned, and rooted in a deep understanding of Christian doctrine and diplomacy. She wrote as one Christian ruler to another, appealing to their shared faith. One of the most critical issues was territory. The knights occupied lands that Poland considered its own. Jadwiga's letters were relentless in their assertion of Polish rights, but she always framed her arguments in the language of justice and peace. She proposed negotiations and arbitration instead of war. In one famous exchange, she met with the Grand Master in person. He arrogantly told her that the land they held was theirs by right of conquest, and they would keep it. Jadwiga famously replied that she would not seek to reclaim the land for its monetary value, but because of the tears of the people who lived there and were oppressed by the knights. She promised that God would eventually judge their actions. Her most impactful letter concerned the Pope. The Teutonic Knights had powerful allies in Rome and across Europe. They used their influence to portray Poland-Lithuania as an untrustworthy semi-pagan state. Jadwiga wrote directly to the Pope and other influential church leaders. In her letters, she meticulously documented the Knights' aggression, their violations of truces, and their cruelty towards civilians. She contrasted their violent actions with her and her husband's efforts to spread Christianity peacefully. She sent envoys with these letters, providing evidence and testimony. Her campaign was effective. She slowly began to turn European opinion against the Knights. They were no longer seen as heroic crusaders, but as land-hungry aggressors. The Pope began to view the Polish-Lithuanian Union more favorably. This diplomatic shift was crucial. It isolated the Knights and gave Poland the moral high ground. It also bought precious time. The new combined state of Poland-Lithuania needed time to consolidate its power, build its armies, and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. Jadwiga did not live to see the final outcome. She died in 1399 at the age of just 25, but her work laid the foundation for the ultimate victory. Her letters created the diplomatic and moral framework that allowed Poland-Lithuania to challenge the Teutonic Order. In 11 years after her death, in 1410, the combined Polish-Lithuanian army faced the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Grunwald. It was one of the largest battles of the Middle Ages. The Knights were crushingly defeated. Their power was broken forever. The victory secured the future of Poland and Lithuania for centuries. It would not have been possible without the union Jadwiga's marriage created, and that union would not have survived its early years without the diplomatic shield her letters provided. She used her quill pen to hold off a holy war long enough for her kingdom to forge a sword. Number 13, can a single edict turn a dynasty against the world? For decades, foreign powers had been carving up China. Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and Japan had all forced the ruling Qing dynasty to sign unequal treaties. They seized port cities, extracted trade concessions, and established spheres of influence. Christian missionaries moved deep into the countryside, often clashing with traditional Chinese culture. By the late 1890s, it felt to many Chinese people that their country was being eaten alive. This frustration gave birth to a secret society, the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, known to Westerners as the Boxers. They practiced martial arts they believed made them impervious to bullets. Their goal was to drive all foreigners out of China. At the heart of the Forbidden City in Beijing sat the Empress Dowager Cixi. She had been the effective ruler of China for nearly 4 decades, ruling from behind the throne for a series of young emperors. She was deeply conservative and suspicious of foreigners. Initially, she viewed the Boxers as a threat to her own dynasty. They were a peasant rebellion, and rebellions were dangerous. But as the Boxer movement grew, some of her court officials saw an opportunity. They argued that the Boxers' anti-foreign rage could be used as a weapon. They could become a national militia to finally expel the Western powers in Japan. Cixi was hesitant. An open war with the combined might of the world's great powers seemed like suicide. But the court was filled with hardliners who fed her a constant stream of reports, many of them exaggerated or completely false about foreign aggression. One of the most damaging pieces of disinformation was a fake diplomatic letter. This letter, supposedly from the foreign legations in Beijing, demanded that Cixi give up all power and permanently retire. It was a forgery designed to push her over the edge. It worked. Feeling insulted and believing that the foreigners were plotting to remove her, Cixi's opinion shifted. She decided to gamble. She would support the Boxers. She would use them to wage a war against the world. On June 21st, 1900, she issued an imperial edict that would change China forever. It was, for all intents and purposes, a formal letter of declaration to the entire nation and to the world. It was read aloud in the Forbidden City and sent out to all provincial governors. The edict was a fiery call to arms. It recounted the decades of humiliation China had suffered at the hands of foreign powers. It accused them of oppression, of disrespecting Chinese gods, and of bullying the nation into submission. It said, "We have been striving to make peace and have shown every consideration to the foreigners, but they are aggressive and unreasonable. They have started the aggression, and the extinction of our nation is imminent. If we just fold our arms and yield to them, I would have no face to see our ancestors after death." The letter commanded every Chinese subject to rise up and attack the foreigners. It was a declaration of war against 11 nations simultaneously: Britain, the United States, France, Germany, Italy, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Japan, Spain, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The Boxer movement, now with the official sanction of the government, exploded across northern China. They laid siege to the foreign legation quarter in Beijing, trapping hundreds of diplomats, their families, and Chinese Christians. For 55 days, the small contingent of guards inside the compound held out against overwhelming numbers of Boxers and imperial troops. Across the country, missionaries and foreign engineers were hunted down and killed. The war that Cixi had declared in her letter had begun. But not everyone obeyed the edict. Some of the most powerful provincial governors in southern and central China saw the declaration as madness. They had modernized their own armies and understood the true military power of the West. They knew a war against the world could not be won. They banded together and secretly agreed to ignore the imperial edict. They made their own deals with the foreign powers, promising to protect foreigners in their territories in exchange for the foreigners not attacking them. This act of mass disobedience, known as the Mutual Protection of Southeast China, kept the war from engulfing the entire country. But it also fatally weakened the Qing dynasty, showing that the central government's word was no longer absolute. An international force of 8 of the 11 nations Cixi had declared war on eventually assembled. This 8-nation alliance, consisting of about 20,000 troops, marched on Beijing. They broke the siege of the legations and took control of the capital. The Empress Dowager Cixi was forced to flee the Forbidden City, disguised as a peasant woman in a cart. The war she had started with a single letter had ended in a humiliating defeat. The aftermath was devastating for China. The Boxer Protocol, the treaty signed in 1901, was the most unequal treaty of them all. China was forced to pay an enormous indemnity, a sum so large it would take them decades to pay off, crippling the national treasury. Foreign troops were to be permanently stationed in Beijing. Officials who had supported the Boxers were to be executed. The letter that was supposed to restore China's pride instead led to its greatest humiliation. It shattered the prestige of the Qing dynasty, which would collapse just a decade later. It proved to a generation of Chinese revolutionaries that the old imperial system was broken beyond repair, and that a new path was needed for the nation. Cixi's letter was a desperate gamble to save her dynasty, but it only hastened its destruction and plunged China into a new era of chaos and change. Number 12. How do you tell Rome you are starting your own empire? In the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire was in crisis. It was stretched too thin, plagued by civil wars, and under constant attack on its frontiers. In the east, the vital province of Syria was a battleground. The city of Palmyra, a wealthy oasis metropolis on the trade route between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, was a key Roman ally in the region. Its ruler, Odaenathus, had been a loyal client king, fighting on Rome's behalf against the Persian Sasanian Empire. But when he and his eldest son were assassinated in 267, power fell to his second wife, Zenobia. No one in Rome expected what happened next. Zenobia was not a typical Roman client ruler. She was highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, and claimed descent from Cleopatra and the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt. She was ambitious. Instead of simply holding Palmyra for her young son, Vabiathus, she began to expand her territory. She was not just a regent, she was an empress in the making. She led her armies, riding on horseback in full military dress. She conquered much of Syria, moved south into Roman Egypt, and north into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. In just a few years, she had carved out a massive territory from the Eastern Roman Empire. For a time, Rome was too preoccupied with its own internal problems and threats in Europe to do much about her. Zenobia was clever in how she presented her actions. Initially, she framed her conquest as acts of a loyal Roman ally, securing the unstable eastern frontier on behalf of Rome. Coins were minted with her son Vabiathus's image on one side and the Roman Emperor Aurelian's on the other. It was a delicate political dance. She was ruling her own empire, but paying lip service to Roman authority. The letter that changed everything was not a single document sent by courier, but a public declaration made in metal. In 271, Zenobia took the final, irreversible step. She issued a new set of coins. On these coins, her son Vabiathus was no longer styled merely as king, but as Augustus, the supreme title of a Roman emperor. And Zenobia herself took the title of Augusta, or Empress. This was not a subtle diplomatic message. It was a direct public challenge to Emperor Aurelian. It was a letter to the world stamped in gold and bronze, declaring the Palmyrene Empire to be the equal of the Roman Empire. There could no longer be any pretense of loyalty. This was a declaration of independence and a claim to imperial power. When news of these coins, this metallic letter, reached Emperor Aurelian, his hand was forced. He had been consolidating his power in the west, and now he had to deal with the breakaway empire in the east. He could not tolerate a rival Augustus. It undermined the very foundation of Roman imperial authority. Zenobia's numismatic message had made a military confrontation inevitable. Aurelian assembled his legions and marched east. The war was swift and brutal. The Palmyrene army, though formidable, was no match for the full might of the Roman legions led by a battle-hardened emperor. Aurelian defeated Zenobia's forces in 2 major battles, and then laid siege to Palmyra itself. Zenobia tried to flee to Persia to seek an alliance, but she was captured by Roman cavalry before she could cross the Euphrates River. The city of Palmyra surrendered. Aurelian was initially lenient, but when the city revolted again after he left, he returned and his legions sacked the magnificent metropolis. The great city of the desert, a center of culture and commerce, was left in ruins. It never recovered its former glory. Zenobia's fate is a matter of historical debate. Some accounts say she starved herself to death or fell ill and died on the way to Rome. The more famous story, however, is that she was brought back to Rome to be paraded in Aurelian's triumph, a grand military parade celebrating his victory. The story says she was bound in golden chains, weighed down with so much jewelry she could barely walk, forced to march through the streets of Rome as a living trophy of the emperor's power. Afterwards, she was supposedly given a villa in Tivoli, where she lived out the rest of her life as a Roman socialite, her children marrying into the Roman nobility. Whatever her ultimate fate, Zenobia's challenge to Rome had a profound impact. Her metallic letter, the coins declaring her son an emperor, was a bold gamble that failed. Her empire lasted less than 5 years, but its fall re-established absolute Roman dominance in the East for a time. The destruction of Palmyra changed the balance of power and trade in the region. More importantly, the story of the brilliant, ambitious queen who dared to challenge the might of Rome became a legend. Her defiant letter was a brief but spectacular moment when the periphery of the empire rose up to claim the center, a story of ambition and consequence that would be told for centuries. Number 11, how do you negotiate with a slaver who sees you as a product? In the 17th century, the Portuguese were a major power in the slave trade along the coast of southwestern Africa. They had established colonies in what is now Angola, and their main business was capturing and exporting African people to work on the sugar plantations of Brazil. One of their main adversaries was the Kingdom of Ndongo. In the 1620s, the ruler of Ndongo sent his sister to Luanda, the Portuguese capital, to negotiate a peace treaty. Her name was Inyinga. The Portuguese governor, trying to humiliate her, received her in a room where he sat on a velvet chair on a raised platform. The only other seating provided for Njinga was a mat on the floor. In the culture of her people, sitting on the floor while the other person sat on a chair was a sign of vassalage. It meant acknowledging the other person as your superior. Njinga refused to accept this insult. She signaled to one of her servants, who immediately dropped to her hands and knees. Njinga then sat on her servant's back for the entire 2-hour meeting, looking the Portuguese governor directly in the eye at the same level. This act of defiance set the tone for her entire life. Njinga was a brilliant diplomat. She negotiated a treaty, converted to Christianity, taking the name Ana de Sousa, and returned home. But the Portuguese did not honor the treaty. They continued their slave raids and political interference. A few years later, her brother died and Njinga became Queen of Indango. For the next 4 decades, she would wage a relentless war against the Portuguese. She was a master of both warfare and diplomacy, and her most powerful weapons were often her letters. Queen Njinga's correspondence with the Portuguese governors and officials is a remarkable record of resistance. Her letters were not the pleas of a victim, they were the shrewd, calculated communications of a sovereign ruler dealing with a hostile foreign power. She used her letters for multiple purposes. Sometimes they were used to declare a truce, to propose a prisoner exchange, or to negotiate trade terms. She would write with the formality and authority of a European monarch, using her Christian name and titles, demanding to be treated as an equal. This in itself was a political act. The Portuguese wanted to categorize her as a tribal chieftain. She forced them to address her as a queen. At other times, her letters were sharp, defiant, and full of cunning. When the Portuguese tried to install a puppet king on her throne, she wrote to other local leaders, forming alliances and coordinating attacks. She used her letters to expose Portuguese hypocrisy. They claimed to be in Africa on a civilizing Christian mission. Njinga, in her letters, would point out the vast difference between their stated religious aims and their actual practice of brutal slave raiding. As a baptized Christian, she could use the language of their own religion against them, questioning how their actions could possibly align with Christian morality. One of her most significant strategic moves was to form an alliance with the Dutch. The Dutch were rivals of the Portuguese and were also trying to gain a foothold in the region. Njinga sent emissaries and letters to the Dutch proposing a military alliance. For a time, they fought together, and with Dutch help, she was able to drive the Portuguese out of much of her territory. Her letters show her to be a geopolitical strategist, playing one European power against another to secure her own kingdom's survival. She was also a master of psychological warfare in her letters. She would alternate between offers of peace and threats of unending war. She built a new kingdom at Matamba, a state that became a safe haven for runaway slaves and those fleeing Portuguese rule. Her reputation grew, and she became a symbol of resistance across the region. Her letters often carried the implicit threat that her armies, swelled by those who had escaped Portuguese slavery, would continue to disrupt their operations indefinitely. In her old age, after decades of war, Njinga once again used letters to secure a final peace. She reestablished communication with the Portuguese and the Pope in Rome. She signed a new treaty that finally recognized her as the legitimate ruler of her kingdom, Matamba, and secured its independence. The Portuguese agreed to limit their slave raiding activities in her territory. She died in 1663 in her 80s, having ruled for nearly 40 years. She had successfully kept her kingdom independent and had fought the Portuguese slave trade to a standstill in her region. Her letters were not just pieces of paper. They were treaties, alliances, declarations of war, and moral arguments. They were the tools she used to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast a colonial superpower. Number 10. Can a request for scholars and books build a nation? In the 7th century, the Korean peninsula was divided into 3 kingdoms: Goguryeo in the north, Baekje in the southwest, and Silla in the southeast. They were in a constant state of war with each other and with their powerful neighbor, Tang Dynasty China. Silla was the smallest and most vulnerable of the 3. In 632, the throne of Silla passed to a woman, Queen Seondeok. It was a controversial move, but she proved to be one of the most effective rulers in Korean history. Queen Sihanouk understood that Silla could not survive on military strength alone. It needed a strong, unified culture and a technological edge. Her strategy was to strengthen her kingdom from within by embracing Buddhism and forging a powerful cultural identity. But her most crucial challenge was external. The other two Korean kingdoms, Baekje and Goguryeo, were forming an alliance and threatening to crush Silla between them. Sihanouk needed a powerful ally. Her only viable option was the Tang Empire in China, ruled by the formidable Emperor Taizong. The problem was that Tang China was not a natural friend. It saw all the Korean kingdoms as vassals and had its own ambitions to control the peninsula. A request for help was a delicate matter. It could be seen as a sign of weakness, an invitation for China to simply conquer Silla instead of helping it. This is where Queen Sihanouk's diplomatic letters came into play. She began a careful and sustained correspondence with the Tang court. We don't have the exact text of all her letters, but historical records like the Samguk History of the Three Kingdoms describe their content and impact. Her letters were a masterclass in diplomacy. She did not just beg for military aid. Instead, she framed her relationship with Tang China as one of a culturally aspirational younger state seeking guidance from a wise, more advanced civilization. She sent tribute missions to the Tang capital, but they carried more than just gold and valuables. They carried letters requesting Buddhist scriptures, scholarly texts, and skilled artisans. She was asking for knowledge, not just soldiers. This was flattering to Emperor Taizong. It portrayed him as a benevolent Confucian ruler, a spreader of civilization, not just a conqueror. By asking for cultural and religious guidance, she was building a relationship based on shared values. She adopted Tang court dress, calendars, and administrative practices, signaling her intention to model Silla on the great Tang Empire. Her letters also contained sharp political intelligence. She provided the Tang Emperor with detailed information about the military strengths and weaknesses of her rivals Baekje and Goguryeo. She argued that these two kingdoms were a threat not just to Silla, but to the stability of the entire region, and, by extension, to the Tang border. She framed the Silla-Tang alliance not as China doing Silla a favor, but as a mutually beneficial partnership to pacify the peninsula under a friendly, pro-Tang regime. The strategy worked. Emperor Taizong was impressed by her intellect and her diplomatic skill. He began to see Silla as a reliable partner. He sent scholars, monks, and texts to Silla, which helped fuel a cultural golden age. Queen Sihanouk used this new knowledge and prestige to build Buddhist temples and, most famously, the Keumshangdae, a stone astronomical observatory. This structure, which still stands today, was a powerful symbol. It showed that Silla was not a backwater kingdom, but a center of science and learning. When Baekje launched a major invasion threatening to destroy Silla, Queen Sihanouk's years of diplomatic letter writing paid off. She sent a desperate plea for military assistance. Because she had already laid the groundwork of trust and mutual interest, Emperor Taizong agreed. He sent a large Tang army to attack Goguryeo, forcing the alliance to fight on two fronts. This relieved the pressure on Silla and saved the kingdom. Queen Sihanouk died before the final unification of the peninsula, but her letters created the Silla-Tang alliance that made it possible. After her death, her successors continued her policy. The combined Silla-Tang forces first conquered Baekje and then Goguryeo. While China hoped to absorb the territory itself, Silla eventually fought off the Tang forces and created the first unified Korean kingdom on the peninsula. This unification, which shaped the future of Korea, was born from the diplomatic strategy of a queen who understood that a request for a book can be more powerful than a request for a sword. Her letters built an alliance that redrew the map of East Asia. Number 9. How do you announce to the world that you are God's daughter? In the 15th century BC, Egypt was a superpower. Its pharaohs were considered living gods, and their authority was absolute. The throne was meant to pass from father to son, but when Pharaoh Thutmose II died, his heir, Thutmose III, was just a small child. The boy's stepmother and aunt, a woman named Hatshepsut, was appointed regent to rule in his place. For a few years, she ruled conventionally as a queen regent for the boy king. But Hatshepsut was not content to be a placeholder. She did something unprecedented. She declared herself pharaoh. A woman ruling as pharaoh was a profound break with thousands of years of tradition. It threatened the cosmic order known as Ma'at. To justify this radical move, Hatshepsut needed a powerful propaganda campaign. She needed to explain why she, a woman, was the rightful king. She did this with a series of monumental letters carved in stone for all to see. The most magnificent of these is at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, a stunning complex of terraces built into a cliffside. The walls of this temple are covered in hieroglyphs and reliefs that tell her story. It is her autobiography, her political manifesto, and her divine letter of appointment, written for the gods, her subjects, and for posterity. The most crucial part of this stone letter is the story of her divine birth. The reliefs depict the god Amun-Ra, the king of the gods, taking the form of her father, Pharaoh Thutmose I. The text describes how Amun-Ra approached Hatshepsut's mother, Queen Ahmose, and conceived a child with her. The god then announces that this child, Hatshepsut, is destined to rule Egypt. He declares, "She shall be the one who will exercise the excellent kingship in this entire land." This was a brilliant political move. Hatshepsut was not just claiming the throne through her royal bloodline, she was claiming it as the literal daughter of the most powerful god in the Egyptian pantheon. She was bypassing the normal rules of male succession by asserting a higher divine authority. No earthly claim could compete with the declared will of Amun-Ra. Another section of her temple's letter details her great expedition to the land of Punt, a mysterious faraway land probably located in modern-day Somalia or Eritrea. This was a massive trade mission, not a military conquest. The carvings show Egyptian ships sailing south, being greeted peacefully by the people of Punt, and returning laden with incredible riches: incense, myrrh, ebony, ivory, gold, and exotic animals. Most importantly, they brought back live myrrh trees, which were then planted in the gardens of the temple. The expedition was a huge economic success, but its depiction on the temple walls was about more than just trade. It was a letter demonstrating her ability to bring prosperity and divine blessings to Egypt. It showed her ruling not through war, but through peaceful commerce that pleased the gods, particularly Amun-Ra, who loved the scent of incense in his temples. To further solidify her rule, Hatshepsut's letters in stone often depict her as a male. In many statues and reliefs, she is shown with all the traditional symbols of a male pharaoh: a kilt, a bare chest, and the false beard of kingship. This was not about denying her gender, but about using the established visual language of power. The office of pharaoh was conceptually male. By adopting male iconography, she was making it clear that she was not a queen consort or a queen regent, but a true and proper pharaoh, fulfilling all the duties of the office. These public letters carved on temple walls and obelisks were incredibly effective. Hatshepsut ruled peacefully for over 20 years. Her reign was a period of great prosperity and artistic flourishing. She was one of the most prolific builders in Egyptian history, commissioning hundreds of construction projects. She re-established trade routes that had been disrupted and brought wealth and stability to the kingdom. The end of her story is mysterious. After her death, her stepson Thutmose III finally took the throne he had waited so long for. Late in his reign, a campaign was launched to erase Hatshepsut from history. Her name was chiseled off monuments. Her statues were smashed and buried. Her images were removed from temple walls. For centuries, her existence was largely forgotten. But stone is harder to destroy than paper. Archaeologists have been able to piece her story back together to read the monumental letters she left behind. Her divine birth story, her account of the expedition to Punt, her very existence as a female king, all changed the world of ancient Egypt. Her letters in stone proved so powerful that her successors felt they had no choice but to try and fail to erase them. Number 8. Can a mother's advice to her daughter prevent a revolution? By the 1770s, Maria Theresa had been ruling the vast Habsburg Empire for over 3 decades. She was the only female ruler in the 650-year history of her dynasty. She was a shrewd, pragmatic, and often ruthless politician who had survived wars and reformed her empire. She was also the mother of 16 children, many of whom she married off to other royal houses in a complex web of alliances. Her youngest daughter was Maria Antonia, who was sent to France at the age of 14 to marry the future King Louis XVI. In France, her name was changed to Marie Antoinette. The marriage was a crucial political alliance between the two great rival powers of Europe, Austria, and France. From the moment her daughter left Vienna, Maria Theresa began a long, intense, and deeply personal correspondence with her. She wrote letters almost weekly. These were not just the loving letters of a concerned mother. They were policy documents. They were strategic instructions. Maria Theresa saw her daughter not just as a child, but as an Austrian asset at the heart of the French court. Marie Antoinette's job was to secure the Franco-Austrian alliance. The letters are a fascinating window into the mind of a powerful ruler. Maria Theresa's advice was incredibly detailed and direct. She told her daughter what to wear, how to do her hair, and who to befriend at court. She wrote, "The only thing that can ruin you is your laziness and your tendency towards amusement. I beg you, do not let yourself be led astray." She constantly chided Marie Antoinette for her frivolity, her love of fashion and gambling, and her failure to perform her royal duties. The primary duty, in her mother's eyes, was to produce an heir. For years, the marriage was not consummated, and Maria Theresa's letters became increasingly frantic, filled with blunt and even clinical advice. But her letters went far beyond personal matters. Maria Theresa had an excellent network of informants at the French court, and she was often better informed about the political situation in Versailles than her own daughter was. She warned Marie Antoinette about the dangers of court factions and the importance of winning the affection of the French people. She wrote presciently about the growing public discontent and the fragile state of the French monarchy. She urged her daughter to live more modestly and to show more seriousness. "You are heading, I fear, for great misfortunes," she warned in one letter. Marie Antoinette often resented the constant criticism. She was a young queen in a foreign land, surrounded by the incredible luxury of Versailles, and she wanted to enjoy her life. She found her mother's letters controlling and tiresome. She would often delay reading them or fail to follow the advice. She continued to spend lavishly on clothes, jewelry, and elaborate parties. She surrounded herself with a small circle of favored friends, which alienated many of the powerful old families at court. She failed to understand the political importance of public perception. Maria Theresa's letters show a growing sense of dread. She could see the storm clouds gathering over France. She understood that the world was changing and that the old style of absolute monarchy was under threat. Her own reforms in Austria were designed to modernize the state and strengthen its finances, things the French monarchy was failing to do. Her advice to her daughter was a desperate attempt to make the French royals see the danger they were in. She was essentially trying to manage the French monarchy by remote control through letters to a teenage queen who was not listening. Maria Theresa died in 1789, years before the start of the French Revolution. Her letters stopped. Without her mother's constant guiding and critical voice, Marie Antoinette became even more isolated and out of touch. The very things her mother had warned her about in her letters, her extravagance, her political meddling on behalf of friends, her reputation as a frivolous foreigner, Latrician, the Austrian woman, became key factors in her profound unpopularity. The public came to see her as the symbol of everything that was wrong with the monarchy. It is impossible to know if history would have been different had Marie Antoinette heeded her mother's advice. Perhaps the French Revolution was inevitable, but Maria Theresa's letters represent a critical, missed opportunity. They were a roadmap for survival written by one of the most successful rulers of the 18th century. They show a clear understanding of the political realities and dangers that her daughter and son-in-law seemed incapable of grasping. The letters did not change the world because the advice within them was ignored, but they show us a world that might have been a revolution that might have been averted or at least mitigated if only a queen had listened to her mother. Number 7, how much gold does it take to buy back a lion's heart? In 1192, King Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, was returning home from the Third Crusade. He had been one of its main leaders, a fearsome warrior, but he had failed to recapture Jerusalem. Shipwrecked in the Adriatic Sea, he tried to travel across mainland Europe in disguise. But a king like Richard, tall, famous, and accustomed to a certain lifestyle, was not easy to disguise. He was recognized and captured near Vienna by Duke Leopold of Austria. the Duke had a personal grudge against Richard, who had insulted him during the crusade. He handed the English king over to his overlord, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI. The capture of a crusading king was a scandal across Christendom. Other kings were supposed to have safe passage, but Henry VI saw an opportunity. He held Richard for ransom. The price he demanded was astronomical 150,000 marks of silver. This was a colossal sum, estimated to be 2 to 3 times the annual income of the English crown. For England, it was a national crisis. Back in England, the news was a disaster. The country was being run by a council of regents, but Richard's younger brother, Prince John, was already plotting to seize the throne for himself. He had allied with King Philip II of France, England's great rival. Both John and Philip were delighted that Richard was a prisoner. They had no interest in seeing him freed. In fact, they sent a message to the emperor offering him a huge sum of money to keep Richard imprisoned for as long as possible. The one person who stood between Richard and perpetual captivity was his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. By this time, Eleanor was nearly 70 years old. She had been a queen of France, then a queen of England. She had been on crusade herself. She had been imprisoned by her own husband, King Henry II, for 16 years. She was one of the most formidable political figures of the Middle Ages. When she heard of her favorite son's capture, she took control. She emerged from her, semi-retirement and became the effective ruler of England. Her first and most important task was to raise the ransom. She did this through a blizzard of letters. Eleanor began a massive kingdom-wide campaign of correspondence. She wrote to the Pope, Celestine III, in a fury. Her letters to him were not the respectful pleas of a supplicant. They were the angry demands of a queen and a mother. She berated him for his inaction. "The kings and princes of the earth have conspired against my son, the Lord's anointed," she wrote. One holds him in chains, another ravages his lands with a cruel enmity. She shamed the Pope for failing to use his authority to protect a crusader king. At the same time, she wrote letters to every bishop, earl, and sheriff in England. These were not requests for donations. They were commands. She laid out the terms of a new crushing tax. It was a 25% levy on all income and movable property for every person in the kingdom, clergy and laity alike. This was an unprecedented level of taxation. She wrote, "We must not be found wanting in this great emergency." Her letters organized the entire administrative machinery of the kingdom, turning it into a giant fundraising operation. She instructed officials on how to assess the tax, how to collect it, and where to store it securely. She also wrote to the Emperor Henry VI himself. Her letters to him were a mix of negotiation, threats, and appeals to his honor. She fought to keep the ransom from being increased and to secure the terms of Richard's release. The process was slow and difficult. For over a year, Eleanor's letters flew back and forth across Europe, a constant stream of pressure, administration, and diplomacy. She had to fight not only the emperor's greed, but also her own son John's treachery. John was spreading rumors that Richard was dead and trying to get the English barons to swear loyalty to him. Eleanor's letters countered this propaganda, reassuring the kingdom that their king was alive and that the ransom would be paid. Finally, the money was raised. A mountain of silver was collected from churches, towns, and individuals across England. It was packed into barrels and shipped to Germany. In early 1194, Eleanor, now in her 70s, personally traveled to Germany to deliver the final payment and escort her son home. Richard was freed. His return to England put an end to John's rebellion. Eleanor of Aquitaine's letter-writing campaign had literally saved the king. It was a stunning feat of administration and will. Without her intervention, Richard the Lionheart might have died in a German prison. Prince John might have succeeded in stealing the throne with French help, which would have dramatically changed the course of both English and French history. The letters a 70-year-old queen wrote from England held a kingdom together, raised a king's ransom, and brought the Lionheart home. Number 6. What if a queen's invitation created a new people? In the mid-18th century, Catherine the Great was the Empress of Russia. She was a German princess who had come to the throne through a coup that deposed her own husband. She was determined to modernize her vast, sparsely populated, and technologically backward empire. One of her biggest challenges was the huge expanse of fertile but empty land along the Volga River in southern Russia. These were frontier lands, vulnerable to raids from nomadic tribes. She needed loyal, hard-working people to settle there, to farm the land, and to create a buffer zone. The Russian peasantry were serfs, legally tied to the land they worked. They could not be moved, so Catherine looked abroad. As a German herself, she knew of the difficult conditions in many of the small German states. The 7 Years' War had devastated the region. Famine, high taxes, and religious strife made life difficult for many farmers and artisans. Catherine saw an opportunity. She decided to write an open letter of invitation to the people of Europe, particularly her former German countrymen. In 1763, she issued her manifesto. This document was not a private letter, but a public proclamation translated into multiple languages and published in newspapers across Europe, especially in Germany. It was a carefully crafted piece of marketing, a letter designed to sell the dream of a new life in Russia. The manifesto made a series of extraordinary promises. First, it offered free land. Immigrants would be given large tracts of fertile farmland for their own use in perpetuity. Second, it promised religious freedom. This was a huge incentive for groups like the Mennonites, who were persecuted in their homelands. In Russia, they could practice their faith without interference. Third, it promised exemption from taxes for 30 years. This was a almost unbelievable economic incentive. Fourth, it guaranteed self-governance. The new settlements would be allowed to run their own schools and local governments, preserving their own language and culture. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, it offered a permanent exemption from military service. For families whose sons were constantly being conscripted into the armies of German princes, this was a promise of peace and security. The response to Catherine's letter was enormous. It created what was called colonist fever in the German states. The agents, paid by the Russian crown, traveled through towns and villages, reading the manifesto aloud and signing up recruits. Between 1763 and 1767, over 30,000 Germans emigrated to Russia. They traveled a long and difficult journey down the Danube River to the Black Sea and then overland to the Volga region. They founded 104 settlements along the river. Life for these new settlers was incredibly hard at first. The climate was harsh, the land was wild, and they were subject to raids. Many died in the early years, but they persevered. They brought with them advanced farming techniques, new crops, and a strong work ethic. They turned the empty steppe into a breadbasket. They remained a distinct community speaking German, running their own German schools and practicing their own religions. They became known as the Volga Germans. Catherine's letter had a profound and lasting impact. It successfully populated a strategic frontier, securing it for the Russian Empire. It brought new agricultural technology and productivity to Russia, but most significantly, it created a new and distinct ethnic group. The Volga Germans flourished for over 150 years, growing into a community of hundreds of thousands. They were a nation within a nation, created by a single letter of invitation. Their story, however, has a tragic ending. Their special privileges were gradually eroded over the centuries. Their loyalty was questioned because of their German heritage. The greatest tragedy came during World War II. The Soviet government, fearing they would collaborate with the invading German army, abolished their autonomous republic. The entire Volga German population, more than 400,000 people, was forcibly deported to Siberia and Central Asia. They were stripped of their property, their culture was suppressed, and tens of thousands died during the brutal relocation. Catherine the Great's letter had created a new world for them. Later historical events, driven by suspicion and war, would destroy it. Number 5, can a letter about grief reshape a monarchy? When Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, died of typhoid fever in 1861, the Queen was utterly devastated. They had been deeply in love, and Albert was not just her husband, he was her chief advisor, her private secretary, and her partner in ruling a global empire. His death at the age of 42 plunged Victoria into a profound and prolonged state of grief that would define the rest of her life in the nature of the British monarchy. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Victoria withdrew completely from public life. She left London for the seclusion of Windsor Castle and then Osborne House. She wore black for the rest of her life, a period of almost 40 years. She refused to open parliament, to attend state ceremonies, or to perform any of the public duties expected of a monarch. The government was in a state of crisis. The public was initially sympathetic, but as the months turned into years, sympathy turned to frustration. The press began to criticize the widow of Windsor. Republican sentiment began to grow. People started asking why they were paying for a monarch who refused to be seen. The Queen's ministers begged her to return to public life. They warned her that her seclusion was endangering the monarchy itself. But Victoria, lost in her grief, could not or would not listen. This is where a remarkable letter comes in. It was written in 1864, 3 years after Albert's death. It was not written by a politician or a bishop. It was written by a man named John Brown. He was not a courtier, he was a Scottish gillie, a servant who had worked for Albert at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. After Albert's death, Victoria's doctors, desperate to find some way to lift her spirits, suggested that a trip to the Scottish Highlands might do her good. She went to Balmoral, a place she and Albert had loved. There, she reconnected with John Brown. He was a plain-spoken, rugged man who treated her not as a queen, but as a woman who needed help. He was not afraid of her grief or her temper. He encouraged her to start riding her pony again, to get out into the fresh air. He became her constant companion and her most trusted servant. The exact content of the letter, or letters, that passed between them is not fully known, as much of their correspondence was destroyed. But accounts from others at court and Victoria's own diaries reveal the nature of their communication. Brown's letters to her were not formal. They were direct, honest, and often blunt. He did not flatter her. He told her what she needed to hear. He encouraged her to find a new way to live, a way to honor Albert's memory by continuing his work. One particularly influential letter, as recounted through third parties, came in response to her profound depression and refusal to engage with her duties. Brown essentially wrote that Prince Albert would not have wanted her to abandon her responsibilities. He argued that the greatest tribute she could pay to her husband was to rule as he would have wanted her to, with diligence and a sense of duty. He framed her return to public life not as a betrayal of her grief, but as the ultimate expression of her love for Albert. He was appealing to her sense of duty, the one thing that could overcome her personal sorrow. This message, coming from a trusted, plain-speaking servant rather than a bowing politician, broke through her defenses. It was honest and real. His letters, combined with his daily presence, slowly began to pull her out of her deep seclusion. She began to take an interest in state papers again. She started to make occasional, brief public appearances. She never returned to the full social life of her youth, but she re-engaged with her role as sovereign. The letter's impact was profound. It helped save the British monarchy from a crisis of its own making. Victoria's return to duty, however partial, quelled the rising tide of republicanism, but it also changed the nature of the monarchy. The glamorous, youthful queen was gone forever. In her place was a new image, the stoic, black-clad matriarch of the nation, a symbol of enduring duty and perpetual mourning. This image of a remote, respectable, and morally serious monarch became the defining feature of the late Victorian era. John Brown's simple, honest letter did not end the Queen's grief, but it channeled it. It convinced her to turn her personal tragedy into a new kind of public persona, one that would redefine the British monarchy for a new age. Number 4, what is the last thing a queen writes before she is executed? For nearly 19 years, Mary, Queen of Scots, was a prisoner. She had fled her own rebellious kingdom of Scotland in 1568, seeking refuge from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England. Instead of refuge, she found a gilded cage. Elizabeth saw Mary as a profound threat. Mary was Catholic, and many Catholics in England and across Europe viewed Elizabeth, a Protestant, as an illegitimate ruler. They believed Mary was the rightful Queen of England. As long as Mary lived, she was a magnet for plots against Elizabeth's life and throne. So Elizabeth kept her under house arrest, moving her from one castle to another, always under guard. Over the years, Mary wrote countless letters. She wrote to her supporters, to other Catholic monarchs, and to Elizabeth herself, pleading for her freedom. Many of these letters were intercepted by Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham. It was a letter that ultimately sealed her fate. Walsingham's agents entrapped Mary into a correspondence that was part of a plot to assassinate Elizabeth, known as the Babington Plot. Mary wrote a letter in which she appeared to consent to Elizabeth's murder. When this letter was discovered, her doom was certain. She was tried for treason and sentenced to death. Elizabeth was hesitant to sign the death warrant. Executing another anointed monarch, her own cousin, was a terrible and dangerous precedent. But the pressure from her council was immense. Finally, in February 1587, she signed the document. Mary was to be beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle. In the final hours of her life, on the night of February 7th, with the sound of the executioner's block being set up in the great hall below, Mary sat down to write one last letter. It was not addressed to her son James, who had largely abandoned her. It was not addressed to Queen Elizabeth, who had condemned her. It was addressed to her former brother-in-law, King Henry III of France. This final letter is a remarkable and moving document. It was not a plea for mercy. It was too late for that. Instead, it was a letter to set the historical record straight. It was her final testament, her last act of self-definition. She began by telling him that she had been sentenced to die and that the execution was scheduled for the next morning. She wrote with a calm and dignified resolve. Today, after dinner, I have been advised of my sentence. I am to be executed like a criminal at 8 in the morning. The main purpose of the letter was to control her own legacy. She knew her enemies would portray her as a traitor and a murderer. In her letter, she insisted that she was dying not for any crime against Elizabeth, but for her Catholic faith. I am to be sent to my death for the Catholic religion, she wrote. She was framing her execution as a martyrdom. This was a powerful final move designed to inspire the Catholic cause in Europe and to cast Elizabeth as a religious persecutor. The letter was also practical. She asked the King of France to pay her loyal servants the salaries they were owed. She listed their names and services, ensuring they would not be forgotten. It was the act of a responsible ruler, taking care of her people even from the brink of the grave. She also requested that he provide for prayers for her soul. She ended the letter by describing the scene around her. Her guards had entered the room and were ordering her to stop writing. She explained that she had to finish quickly. Her final lines are hurried but firm. She signed the letter, "Your most loving and most true sister, Mary R." The R stood for Regina, the Latin for Queen. To the very end, she asserted her royal status. The letter was smuggled out of the castle by one of her loyal attendants. It reached France and was preserved. It did not change the immediate outcome. Mary was executed the next morning as scheduled. But the letter had a powerful long-term impact. It became a key document in the Catholic portrayal of Mary as a martyr. It shaped her image for centuries, helping to create the romantic and tragic legend of Mary, Queen of Scots, that endures to this day. Her final letter did not save her life, but it was a successful attempt to win the verdict of history, to write her own epitaph in the face of her enemies. Number 3, can you sign your cousin's death warrant without guilt? The letter was just a piece of parchment. It contained legal language ordering the execution of Mary, late Queen of Scots. But for Queen Elizabeth I of England, it was the most difficult document she would ever have to sign. For years, she had resisted the calls from her Parliament and her Privy Council to execute her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. The political and religious reasons were compelling. Mary was a Catholic with a strong claim to the English throne. She was the focal point of numerous plots to depose Elizabeth and restore Catholicism to England. The most recent of these, the Babington Plot, had provided clear evidence of Mary's complicity in a plan to assassinate Elizabeth. The threat she posed was undeniable, but Elizabeth's hesitation was profound. They were cousins, granddaughters of King Henry VII. They were both anointed queens. To execute a fellow monarch was to violate the divine right of kings, the very principle upon which her own authority rested. If one queen could be tried and executed by her subjects, what was to stop it from happening again? It was a terrifying precedent. She also seems to have felt a personal human reluctance to order the death of her own kin. She famously raged, "Cannot I have one that would rid me of this woman?" wishing someone would assassinate Mary so she would not have to sign the warrant. The pressure, however, was immense. Her spymaster, Walsingham, and her chief advisor, Lord Burghley, argued that as long as Mary lived, Elizabeth's own life was in danger and the stability of the Protestant kingdom was at risk. Parliament twice petitioned her to order the execution. For months after Mary's trial and conviction in October 1586, Elizabeth prevaricated. She kept the signed death warrant but refused to have the Great Seal of England affixed to it, which was necessary to make it legal. The letter that finally forced her hand was not one she wrote, but one she received. Or rather, it was a stream of intelligence reports and rumors that her council presented to her as undeniable fact. In early February 1587, Burghley came to her with alarming news. He told her of new plots. He said Spanish troops had landed in Wales. He said Mary had escaped from Fotheringhay Castle. He said the city of London was rising up in rebellion. None of this was true. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of disinformation by her own council designed to create an atmosphere of panic and force her to act. It worked. Believing the kingdom was on the brink of invasion and civil war, Elizabeth finally gave in. On February 1st, 1587, she summoned her secretary, William Davison, and ordered him to bring her the warrant. She signed it, Elizabeth R. Her signature doomed her cousin, but even then she tried to create distance from the act. According to Davison's later testimony, she gave him the signed warrant, but told him not to have the Great Seal applied immediately. She seemed to want to keep her options open, to maintain a sliver of deniability, but her council saw their chance. They were tired of her indecision. Davison took the signed letter to Lord Burghley. Burghley convened a secret meeting of the Privy Council without informing the Queen. They decided to act on their own authority. They had the Great Seal affixed to the warrant and dispatched it immediately to Fotheringhay Castle. They took the final, irreversible step themselves, knowing it was what the Queen wanted, even if she could not bring herself to give the final, explicit command. Mary was executed on February 8th. When the news was brought to Queen Elizabeth, she flew into a rage. She claimed that her orders had been defied. She insisted she had not given the final authorization for the warrant to be sent. She accused her council of acting behind her back. Her fury was focused on her secretary, William Davison. He became the scapegoat. He was arrested, put on trial, and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Lord Burghley was banished from court for a time. Was Elizabeth's anger genuine, or was it a calculated political performance? Historians have debated this for centuries. It is likely a combination of both. She may have genuinely felt tricked by her council and horrified that the deed was finally done. But her rage was also politically necessary. It allowed her to distance herself from the execution in the eyes of the world, especially in the eyes of King James VI of Scotland, Mary's son, and the Catholic powers of Europe, like France and Spain. She could claim that the execution was the result of an overzealous council, not her own royal command. The letter, the signed death warrant, changed the world. It eliminated the most significant internal threat to Elizabeth's rule, securing the future of Protestant England. It was one of the final triggers that led King Philip II of Spain to launch the Spanish Armada against England the following year. It set a precedent for the trial and execution of a monarch that would resonate a century later in England's own civil war. And it left Queen Elizabeth with a legacy of ruthless pragmatism and a personal emotional burden that, by all accounts, she carried for the rest of her life. The ink on that one letter ended, one queen's life and secured another's throne. Number 2, how do you deliver a message when the enemy controls the land and the sea? In 48 BC, the Roman Republic was tearing itself apart. Two of its greatest generals, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, were locked in a brutal civil war. After a decisive victory in Greece, Caesar pursued Pompey to Egypt. But by the time Caesar arrived in Alexandria, Pompey was already dead, murdered on the orders of the advisors to the young Egyptian pharaoh, Ptolemy G. The advisors presented Caesar with Pompey's head, hoping to win his favor. Caesar was disgusted. Egypt itself was in the midst of its own civil war. The young Ptolemy She was on the throne, but he was in a power struggle with his older sister, Cleopatra VII. According to their father's will, they were supposed to rule together as husband and wife, following Egyptian royal tradition. But Ptolemy's advisors had driven Cleopatra out of Alexandria. She had raised her own army and was camped in the desert, waiting for a chance to retake her throne. Caesar found himself in a difficult position in Alexandria. He was a Roman general in a foreign capital with only a small force of soldiers. The Egyptian royal army, loyal to the boy King Ptolemy, was much larger and controlled the city. Caesar decided to stay and settle the Egyptian succession dispute himself. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he would act as the arbiter. He summoned both Ptolemy and Cleopatra to appear before him in the royal palace. Ptolemy arrived easily. He was already in the city. But for Cleopatra, it was a seemingly impossible challenge. The city was controlled by her brother's forces. The harbor was patrolled by his ships. She was a fugitive outside the walls. Any attempt to enter the city openly would mean her certain capture and death. She needed to get a message to Caesar, but more than that, she needed to get herself to Caesar. This is where one of the most famous letters, or rather, message deliveries, in history took place. Cleopatra devised a plan of incredible audacity. She traveled by a small boat to the harbor of Alexandria under the cover of darkness. There she met with a trusted Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus. According to the account by the Greek historian Plutarch, Cleopatra laid herself down at full length inside a roll of bedding or a carpet. Other accounts say it was a large sack for bed linens. Apollodorus then tied up the bundle, threw it over his shoulder, and simply walked through the city gates and into the royal palace. He passed the king's guards, who assumed he was just a merchant delivering some goods. Apollodorus carried his precious cargo directly to Caesar's private apartments. He set the bundle down and undid the ropes, and out of the rolled-up carpet tumbled the 21-year-old Queen of Egypt. Caesar was completely captivated. He had been expecting a desperate message from a defeated queen. Instead, the queen herself had appeared in his room, having bypassed an entire army through sheer cunning and personal courage. It was an entrance that demonstrated her intelligence, her boldness, and her absolute refusal to be defeated. This act was her letter. It was a message delivered in person, a statement of intent that no written words could match. It told Caesar that she was not a conventional monarch. She was a risk-taker, a strategist, and a woman of immense charm and determination. They spent the night talking. By morning, Caesar was convinced. He would support her claim to the throne. When the young King Ptolemy discovered the next morning that his sister was not only in the palace, but had already won Caesar's support, he flew into a rage. He ran into the streets screaming that he had been betrayed. This sparked the siege of Alexandria, a months-long battle in which Caesar and his small Roman force, along with Cleopatra, were trapped in the palace quarter, fighting against the Egyptian army. Caesar, a brilliant general, ultimately won the war. Ptolemy she drowned in the Nile while trying to escape. Caesar restored Cleopatra to the throne not as a sole ruler, but with an even younger brother as her co-ruler, whom she later dispensed with. Cleopatra and Caesar began a famous love affair. She bore him a son, Caesarion. Her daring letter had not just won her a kingdom, it had secured her the most powerful ally in the world. It tied Egypt to Rome and changed the political landscape of the entire Mediterranean. The simple, audacious act of rolling herself up in a carpet and having herself delivered to Caesar's room was a message of such power that it altered the course of two great civilizations. Number 1. Can a queen's signature on a contract open up a new world? By 1492, Christopher Columbus, a Genoese navigator, had spent the better part of a decade trying to sell his idea. He was convinced that he could reach the rich spice markets of the East Indies by sailing west across the Atlantic. It was a radical idea. Most educated people knew the world was round, but they believed the ocean was far too wide to be crossed. The calculations Columbus used were wildly optimistic, underestimating the Earth's circumference and overestimating the eastward span of Asia. He had pitched his enterprise of the Indies to the courts of Portugal, England, and France. They had all turned him down. His idea was considered too risky, too expensive, and probably impossible. His last hope was Spain. He had been lobbying the Spanish monarchs, Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon, for years. They were intrigued, but they had a more pressing concern: the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from the Moorish kingdoms. For 10 years, they had been waging the final war to conquer the last remaining Muslim stronghold, the Emirate of Granada. All of Spain's resources, money, and attention were focused on this war. There was nothing left for a speculative sea voyage. In early 1492, Granada finally fell. The Reconquista was complete. Columbus saw his chance and made his final pitch. But he was again rejected. The royal council still considered his demands too high and his calculations flawed. Dejected, Columbus packed his bags and began to leave Spain, probably heading for France to try his luck there one last time. But Queen Isabella had a change of heart. What caused it is a matter of historical debate. One key figure was Luis de Santangel, the keeper of the royal finances. He was a powerful court official who had always supported Columbus. After Columbus left, Santangel went to the Queen and made an impassioned plea. He argued that the cost of the expedition was relatively small compared to the potential rewards. If Columbus was right, Spain would gain access to the immense wealth of the Indies, bypassing the trade routes controlled by the Portuguese and the Ottoman Turks. It would give Spain a huge advantage over its rivals. He also appealed to a religious zeal, arguing that the voyage could open up new lands for Christian evangelization. He even offered to help finance the expedition from his own funds. His arguments swayed Isabella. She was a deeply devout and ambitious monarch. The victory at Granada had filled her with a sense of divine purpose. The idea of spreading Christianity and gaining an economic edge over Portugal was a powerful combination. She made a decision. She sent a royal messenger to ride after Columbus and bring him back to court. When Columbus returned, he didn't just get verbal approval. He got a formal, written contract. This document, known as the Capitulations of Santa Fe, was signed on April 17, 1492. It was a letter of agreement between the monarchs and the navigator. The terms were extraordinarily generous to Columbus, a sign of how much Isabella was now invested in the project. The letter granted Columbus the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea for all the islands and mainlands he might discover. It made the title hereditary, meaning his descendants would hold it forever. It appointed him viceroy and governor general of all these new lands. It gave him 10% of all the gold, silver, pearls, spices, and other merchandise found or traded within his jurisdiction. This was not just a commission for a voyage of discovery. It was a letter that preemptively signed away a vast portion of a new unknown world to one man. And Queen Isabella's signature on that document is one of the most consequential acts in human history. It was the letter that launched the age of discovery. It funded the 3 small ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, that set sail from Palos de la Frontera on August 3rd, 1492. When Columbus made landfall in the Americas that October, he did not just discover a new land for Europeans. He initiated a massive and often brutal collision of worlds. The letter led directly to the European colonization of the Americas. It led to the vast Spanish Empire, funded by the gold and silver of the New World. It triggered a massive exchange of plants, animals, diseases, technologies, and ideas between the Eastern and Western hemispheres, known as the Columbian Exchange. This exchange transformed the ecology, agriculture, and populations of the entire planet. It also led to the devastation of indigenous populations through disease and conquest. The world we live in today, its demographics, its politics, its economies, its very diet, was fundamentally shaped by the consequences of the voyage that was authorized by that single signed letter. Queen Isabella did not just sign a contract with a sea captain, she signed the starting orders for the modern world.